Good afternoon. My name is Yves van Derm. I think most of you probably know me. I think it's my pleasure to introduce the session. I'll introduce my colleague Erica, our main speaker for today, in a minute. Just wanted to sort of give you a bit of insight. This is the first of 5 webinars focused on Belgium from the lens of our global human capital trends. We want to make them interactive webinars in terms of we also want to have some Q&A moments, which we'll foresee later in the presentation. We'll start with that as well today. This is the first of 5, which is largely setting the scene of our 3rd year of the social enterprise. I will try not to steal any thunder of Erica in doing the introduction, so it will be a bit more of a formal. One of the 5, very practically, we're looking forward to have you join as many sessions. The structure of the next 4 will be very clear as you hear Erica in terms of why we selected the 4. If it wouldn't be clear by the end of Erica's session, very happy for you to raise the question, and we'll try to sort of bring it to perspective on the next 4. You can register to the other ones. Very practically, you will get a link to the Zoom at the start of the day of the session itself, just for logistics purposes as well. So I think that's important to know. I think the social enterprise at work, paradox as a path forward. I'm sure paradox might be already triggering some questions. Just a quick introduction. Apart from myself, Erica Volini, our global human capital leader, and I would say one of the main authors for the end year. I'm not sure exactly how many years you've been doing that, Erica, but I think you will be teeing it up from a global perspective. And as we move on, I'll be spending a bit of time sort of giving a bit of a Belgium lens in terms of the trends and the results and what is common and what is different. And we'll be happy to sort of wrap up with a number of questions moving forward. Having said that, Erica, I think the floor is yours.
Okay, excellent. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to talk about our Human Capital Trends Report. And as Yves mentioned, the title of our report this year is The Social Enterprise at Work, Paradox as a Path Forward. And I want to break that down for you. Let me start by talking about social enterprise. So we've actually been talking about the concept of a social enterprise now for 3 years. We started in 2018 when we first wrote about the social enterprise. The report that year was titled The Rise of the Social Enterprise. And we define a social enterprise as an organization whose mission combines revenue growth and profit making with the need to respect and support its environment and stakeholder network. And frankly, since 2018, we've really seen the social enterprise go from an idea to a reality, as we've seen many organizations adopt this viewpoint that an organization's purpose has to be more than just delivering profit, that it needs to be about caring for its broader set of stakeholders, whether that's the customers, the employees, suppliers, the communities in which we serve, and society as a whole. And so this year we wanted to explore the concept of the social enterprise as at work. And if we really wanted to view ourselves as social enterprises, what would that look like as we look at the decade moving forward? And in a minute, I'll define what paradox means and why we see that as a path forward here. But before I get started, as Yves mentioned, this is the 10th year of our annual Human Capital Trends Report. And what really makes this report special is the fact that it's based on a global survey. Back in 2013, when we put that survey out, we had about 1,300 respondents. This year, we had 9,000 respondents from across 119 countries. So this is truly the largest longitudinal study of its kind. And when we think about the survey itself, we don't just issue the survey to HR professionals. In fact, 40% of our survey respondents are from the business, they're non-HR, and 1,500 were C-suite leaders, because we really want to recognize that when we talk about human capital issues, we're not just talking about HR issues. We are talking about the issues that impact the organization as a whole and that need to be dealt with by the entire leadership team of the organization. So with that introduction, let me talk briefly about the report itself to give you all a preview. And I thought I would start out by sharing just a few of the statistics from this year's report that I think really stuck out to us. Because as you can imagine, with 9,000 respondents, we got a lot of data and we spend an awful amount of time going through that data. And some of the data this year gave us great hope. Some of it caused us a little bit of concern, and some of it, frankly, left us a bit confused. So let me share a couple of those statistics with you. And I want to start with the number 12. And this was a statistic that really gave us a lot of hope, because after years of predictions that the outlook for humans at work is grim and that robots are coming to replace all of the jobs, we were very pleased to see that only 12% of our 9,000 respondents said their organization is using AI primarily to replace workers. In fact, the majority, I believe 55% of our survey respondents, said they are using AI to assist workers. And the majority of our respondents also believe that the number of jobs would either stay the same or increase as a result of AI. So this is telling us that individuals are recognizing what technology can do, but also that there's still an absolute role for humans in the workplace. Now let's talk about the next statistic, and this is one that caused us, frankly, a great deal of concern, which is the number 16, which is that while 84% of our respondents agreed that the continual reinvention of the workforce through lifelong learning is important or very important to their strategy, only 16%, only 1 out of every 6 respondents said they're planning on making a significant investment increase in continual lifelong learning over the next 3 years. And that was pretty concerning, especially given that 53% of our respondents said they expect that between 50 to 100% of their workforce will need to fundamentally change their skill sets within that same time period. So yes, there's a recognition that we still need human skills in the workplace, and AI is not going to take over all the jobs. And yes, we acknowledge that everyone's skills need to fundamentally change, but organizations are not making the investment that's required. And then finally, the third statistic that we think really highlights the situation that we're in is 11. Despite the fact that there is so much need and so much data actually out there and available to us to understand what's happening with the workforce, the culture, and the organization, only 11% of respondents are producing workforce insights in real time. And this actually left us very confused, because here we are in a world where we have so much technology and so much data at our fingertips. We've never needed more real-time data on the workforce than right now. With so much change happening, how can you possibly have a pulse on what's going on? And yet only 11% of our respondents are producing that workforce information in real time. In the weeks and the months that our team pored over all of this data and tried to make sense of all of it, there was one word that kept coming to mind for us, and that is the word paradox. And hopefully everyone's aware the word paradox means a situation, person, or thing that combines contradictory features or qualities. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we are absolutely living in a world of paradoxes right now. In our personal lives, I keep thinking to myself, my calendar is empty, yet I feel more emotionally overwhelmed than I've ever have before. We are more physically distant as individuals, yet many of us, including myself, feel that we're more socially intimate than we've ever been before. And these paradoxes extend to the workplace as well. And if we thought about a couple of them that are hitting us right now, the first one is this paradox between connection and distance. We are more physically distant as coworkers than we've ever been, yet there has never been a greater need for us to connect to one another and create that sense of connection. Safety and privacy. We are all incredibly worried about our safety at work. And yet, in order to make people feel safe, frankly, we need to invade their privacy, which could then make them feel unsafe. That's a paradox that we're having to tackle. And then finally, this paradox between productivity and efficiency. We've never needed to do more to be more productive than the situation we're facing right now, but we have to do it while we're still trying to be as efficient as possible. And when we look at all three of these paradoxes, they have a similar theme. And that is, on the surface, it feels like technology is the answer. Technology is the answer to solving these paradoxes. But that's really not the case. Let's dive a bit deeper. As we look at how we're going to promote connection, even though that we are physically distant as coworkers, you could say, well, hey, that's what video technology is for. That's what video conferencing is for. Here we are on Zoom. We're all connecting with one another. And yet the reality is that virtual workers are more lonely now than they've ever been before. Why? Because technology alone cannot create that sense of connection. In order to create that sense of connection, you need leaders and cultural norms working with workplace technology so that the technology is used to promote rather than detract from team well-being and engagement. It's about that combination of humans and machines. The same thing goes for safety and privacy. We've seen many places in the world use contact tracing in order to create a sense of safety. But the reality is we have so much great contact tracing technology, yet in the US, and I know this exists in other countries, we are looking for 300,000 human contact tracers right now. Why? Because in order to do effective contact tracing, it's not just about the technology. You need humans, you need people with listening skills, with empathy, to be able to work with individuals who've been exposed to this virus and understand where they've been, who they've come in contact with. And that requires something that technology can simply not provide. The same thing goes for productivity and efficiency, right? We can look to automation and robotics as a way to provide us with efficiency, to do the work faster. But over the past 2 decades, we have not seen that translate into productivity gains. And that's because it is not through the technology alone, but through that combination of technology and humanity that allows us to turn efficiency into productivity. When we think of all these examples, and the reason why I wanted to talk about them, it highlights the central paradox for this year's report and the question we believe that organizations need to tackle if they want to pave their path forward for the next decade and beyond. And that is it possible to remain distinctly human in a technology-driven world? Now, we believe the answer is yes. And this goes back to the title, Paradox as a Path Forward. We believe that if organizations have the ability to solve this paradox, to find a way to remain distinctly human in this world of technology, that will be the path forward, that is the way in which organizations can drive that productivity and ultimately that value and that meaning that they're trying to create. And our report this year was set to offer a way forward. Now, as we look at this particular paradox of how to remain distinctly human in a technology-driven world, this isn't really something new. In fact, this is something that's been emerging over the course of the last decade as we reviewed all the human capital trends reports that we put out over the past 10 years. What we found is that as we look at all the different events that have happened over the course of the past decade, there's 2 major forces that have existed in organizations. You've, of course, have had on the social side and the human side, we've seen new ways of organizations doing work. We've seen networks of teams emerging, the redesign of jobs and the redesign of work, and these new social contracts emerge between employees and workers and their organizations. At the same time, we've seen massive progress as it relates to technology, the emergence of the cloud, revolutionary technologies like drones coming into the workplace, an explosion of data, and exponential change happening. But the reality is that as we look at these 2 powerful forces in organizations, they're often kept separate and distinct from one another. The efforts on humanity on one side and the efforts around technology on the other. And when we keep these 2 powerful forces separate, we find that they create a series of conflicts in organizations. And there are 3 conflicts in particular that we have found, and I'm going to go through them here. The first is the conflict between belonging and individuality. We know that technology gives us the ability to make everything individualized, to personalize everything down to the absolute last detail. Yet as humans, we truly desire to have that sense of belonging. I'm belonging to something bigger than myself. So how do we bridge that gap between individuality and fostering a sense of belonging moving forward? The second conflict we see emerging when humanity and technology are kept separate in organizations is that between security and reinvention. We know technology gives us the ability to reinvent. It forces us, frankly, to reinvent on a constant basis. Yet as humans, we desire a sense of security. So how do you turn this constant need for reinvention into a sense of security that can allow humans to feel that they have a place, a secured place in the work world? And then finally, this conflict between boldness and uncertainty. We know in a world of technology that anything that can change inevitably will, and that lends itself to this uncertain environment. But as humans, we desire a sense of confidence to make bold steps forward. We want to make progress. We want to walk through that proverbial dark tunnel and get to the light at the end. So how do you turn this world of uncertainty into a future perspective that can give us the confidence to move ahead? These were the three conflicts that we evaluated as we went through our research this year to determine what the path forward could be. And what we discovered is that we believe organizations need to adopt a new way of being and a new way of thinking, a new set of DNA, if you will, in order to bridge the gaps between these conflicts and chart that path forward of bringing humans and technology together. And I want to talk about, there were three attributes of that DNA that we felt were essential for organizations to embrace. And those are the three that I want to talk you through today. So let's start with the first conflict that I went through, which is that conflict between belonging and individuality. And as we talked about, the conflict here really begs us to ask the question, what if instead of creating divisions, individuality could become a source of strength, born of bringing together unique complementary abilities in the pursuit of shared goals? And we call this, when organizations truly have the ability to do it, we believe that means that they are embracing purpose. They are embedding purpose into their DNA. And an organization that truly embraces purpose is one that doesn't rely on lofty mission statements and value statements as a way to provide purpose. These organizations are one that turn purpose into meaning for their work, for their workforce on an everyday basis. And there are three trends chapters. What you'll see as we go through each of the three attributes of the DNA, of which purpose is the first one, is that for each of those attributes, we've identified three trends, that's what you see at the bottom, that we believe are essential to being able to embrace that attribute. So in order to embrace purpose, the three trends are belonging, designing work for well-being, and post-generational workforce. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these in detail given our time, and you have the follow-up sessions that Eve mentioned, but I just want to give you a highlight. When we talk about belonging, oftentimes organizations focus on belonging as being creating a sense of comfort, making people feel that they can, quote, bring their authentic self to work, be treated fairly and respectfully. But we see belonging as much more. If organizations really want to embrace purpose, then they need to move from comfort to establishing a sense of connection, and ultimately to valuing the contribution that individuals are bringing to work every day. When you're able to value that contribution, you can take something that's very individual, very personal, what they're contributing, and link it to the organization's mission and values. That's a way to embrace purpose. The same thing goes for well-being. We know that well-being it's so important, it's critical. Actually, well-being was our #1 trend this year. We've seen mental well-being is at its peak, especially in the context of the pandemic. But we often see that organizations treat well-being as something on the side, a set of programs to the side. You do your work, and then if you are getting stressed, you go over and you tap into a bunch of well-being programs. Well, we believe that if you really want to embrace purpose, if you really want to provide meaning in the work that individuals are doing, you need to design work for well-being. You can't have well-being off to the side. You actually need to embed well-being into how you're designing work. So you're taking something that is so individual and personal, their physical, their mental well-being, and you're embedding it into what they're doing every single day. And then the final trend under this umbrella of purpose is what we're calling the post-generational workforce, which is a recognition of the fact that we can no longer segment the workforce by generation. That doesn't get to the heart of who an individual is. Because whether I'm in Gen Z or I'm a millennial or I'm a boomer or I'm an Xer, honestly, that doesn't tell me what's important to me as it relates to my career. And that now with all this data that's available, we have the ability to segment our workforce in much more nuanced ways, to start to understand individuals and their personal attributes, to recognize their individuality and use that as a way that we can foster a greater sense of belonging and connection to the work itself. So those are the three trends under purpose and what we believe it means to truly embrace purpose and bridge that gap between individuality and belonging. I want to move on to the second attribute in an organization's DNA that we believe they need to embrace. And that has to do with this conflict that we talked about between security and reinvention. And we call this attribute potential because we believe that instead of being perceived as a threat, reinvention should become the means for finding security in the midst of ongoing change. And that an organization that truly embraces potential is one that doesn't orient their workforce programs based on what a person has proven that they can do, what shows up on their resume, but instead is focused on what a person has the ability to do. And that an organization that embraces potential is one that puts processes and programs in place to help individuals get to their fullest potential as humans. And again, there were three trends chapters that we identified here. You see them at the bottom: super teams, knowledge management, and beyond reskilling. As it relates to all of these three, talk about what we can do to help humans reach their maximum potential. Super teams is all about the integration between humans and AI, what we call putting AI into the group. Instead of looking at AI as a replacement strategy, and again, if you remember back to the statistic that 12%, the majority of organizations aren't looking at AI as a substitution of humans. Most are looking at AI as a way to assist humans, but that doesn't really help them maximize their potential. If we really want to use AI to optimize human potential, we need to think about it as a collaboration strategy, as a way of putting AI alongside humans in a team to help humans focus on what they do best. That's what super teams is about. Knowledge management is about what you think it is. It's about knowledge management, but it's not just about the storing and sharing of knowledge. It's about how to actually create knowledge and disseminate knowledge so that humans have the ability to take that knowledge and build it into the work they're doing every day, so that every day they're improving their potential for what they could do next. And then the last trends chapter here is beyond reskilling. And we start this chapter by saying, reskilling alone may be a strategic dead end. Now, we're not saying reskilling isn't important. But what we're saying is, in a world where the half-life of skills continues to decline, is the best investment continuing to train on new skills that you're going to have to continue to update every 1 or 2 years? I think about it like a hamster wheel, and that's what it feels like organizations are on right now. Instead, we believe that organizations need to shift to building resilience, focusing on those enduring capabilities that will transcend jobs and roles. And not just thinking about the capabilities needed for the jobs that exist within the four walls of the organization, but to embrace what it means to be a social enterprise and focus on those capabilities that are needed for their broader ecosystem and for society as a whole. That's how we're going to maximize human potential. And all three of these are designed to give individuals a sense that reinvention isn't something to be fearful of. Reinvention is something to lean into. It's something to make part of what you do, because the more you reinvent, the more you use technology to change the work you're doing, the more you absorb knowledge so that you can learn and connect different pieces of knowledge. And the more that you focus on building those new capabilities, the more security you will actually have. That's what potential is about. And then the final attribute, so we've talked about purpose, we've talked about potential, and now the third attribute that we want to talk about is the one that helps us to resolve this conflict between boldness and uncertainty. And we call that perspective, which is the idea that instead of prompting doubt, let's look at uncertainty as something that can give rise to new possibilities that will give us the opportunity to shape the future through decisive action. Because if we're paralyzed by the uncertainty that exists, we will never be able to take those bold steps forward. And as we looked at perspective, the 3 trends chapters that we have here are compensation, governing workforce strategies, and ethics and the future of work. And we picked these areas, especially compensation and ethics, because we believe these are 2 areas where organizations are stuck. Okay? Where they don't have the ability to have that future perspective because there is so much uncertainty. As we looked at compensation, we saw that 55% of organizations have redesigned compensation in the last 12 to 18 months, yet another 63% of those same respondents are planning on redesigning it again in the next 12 to 18 months. We call that the compensation conundrum. And we believe that organizations are stuck right now continuing to redesign compensation. And we had to ask ourselves why. And what we found is that it's because they haven't built their compensation strategies on a set of principles, human principles, that give them the perspective and the confidence they need to keep their compensation strategies intact for an extended period of time. So in this chapter, we really talk about what those human principles are that compensation strategies need to be built upon in order to have that perspective for the future moving forward. The same thing goes for ethics and future of work. We know ethics is a big topic. We know it's a topic that organizations have been talking about, especially as it relates to technology, tech ethics. But as we think about ethics and the future of work, we see a lot of organizations trying to form their perspective by asking, could we? Could we do this? Could we do that? Could we use technology to monitor an individual at work? Could we use the alternative workforce as a way to do work differently moving forward? And the answer is always going to be yes, but we don't believe could we is the question we should be asking. Instead, we should be asking, how should we? Recognizing that you need to understand the ethical implications of the decisions that are being made to be able to have the right perspective and make those bold decisions moving forward. And then finally, the last chapter here is called Governing Workforce Strategies, and this will relate to that 11% that I talked about earlier. Only 11% of organizations are producing workforce insights in real time. And we don't believe the issue here is that they have enough data. In fact, most organizations are drowning with the amount of data that they have. And they have plenty of technology to give them access to the insights. But what we found is that they're not asking the right questions, that they're not asking questions that actually give them a true sense of what's happening with their work, their workforce, their culture, and their organization. That they ask and report on metrics like diversity and inclusion, and they report that they say this percentage of my workforce is women, or this percent of my workforce is underrepresented minorities, but they actually don't understand whether those individuals have positions of influence within the organization. And if they don't have positions of influence, does it matter that 50% of your organization is women? I'm not sure, because you're not changing the mindset that those individuals are bringing. Does it matter that you're investing $100 million in learning or new technology if your jobs actually aren't evolving to embed that new technology and that new learning and change the way that work's getting done? I don't think so. So it's about asking those next level questions to really understand what is happening in your workplace. And in this chapter, we actually talk about the 12 questions we believe need to be asked in order to govern workforce strategies moving forward. So these 3 attributes of purpose, potential, and perspective, these are the attributes that we believe represent the DNA of the social enterprise at work. We believe embracing these three attributes will help us to resolve those conflicts that emerge when we keep technology and humanity separate. And that when you bring these three attributes to the forefront, you will actually be able to remain distinctly human in the technology-driven world. Now, this is a big change for organizations to tackle. This is not something that can be done through just a series of quick programs. This has to be done across the entire enterprise. But we believe this is a tremendous opportunity for the HR organization right now. And this slide is here because I look at what's happening right now in the context of the pandemic, the same way I looked at the 2008-2009 global recession. Back in 2008 and 2009, we saw the CFO and the finance organization take a lead role in helping the organizations get through the recovery. Well, right now in the context of the pandemic, this is a moment for HR and the CHRO. There has been a lot written around, in the context of the pandemic, people understanding finally the scope of HR, what the HR organization has the ability to do. And we believe that HR and the CHRO have a tremendous role to play as we're emerging from the pandemic, as we're moving from respond into a period of recovery and ultimately thrive. As organizations look to embrace these new attributes of their DNA, there's an opportunity for HR to take the lead. And the 10th chapter in our trends report is written to try to talk through what that opportunity is. We wrote it as a memo to HR, literally a memo, a letter, because HR has been a reader of our Human Capital Trends Report, our primary reader for the past decade. And we wanted to talk about what we've seen over the past 10 years. And the truth is, we saw a lot of progress. In fact, HR, as we looked back on many topics, the progress in HR was the most significant. And we asked a very pointed question in our survey this year as to whether or not our respondents believed that HR will be a distinct function moving forward. And the good news is that a vast majority, I think it was about 96% of our respondents, said they expect HR to remain a distinct function. But those same respondents said, 55% said they expect HR will need to significantly change in the next 12 to 18 months. And when we look at everything we're talking about here and the role that HR has to play, we see two dimensions of that change. And this is what's in this chapter. The first is for HR to expand its focus. Historically, we see that HR focuses very much on the full-time employees. That's their customer base. Well, we believe in this new world, the future of work, the expanded workforce, that HR has to expand its focus to the holistic workforce and frankly to the work itself. So many of our trends this year center around work and using work as a powerful force to bring about needed change. HR has the opportunity to really own this topic of work and help the organization, especially in the context of the pandemic, to reimagine work for the future. What should work look like? How do we make work happen moving forward in a way that's going to allow organizations to bring that distinctly human side to the forefront? And the second major shift we see for HR is for HR to extend its influence, to be looking beyond the function of HR itself to the enterprise as a whole, and ultimately to the ecosystem in which they operate. As organizations are becoming social enterprises, they need to care about the broader environment in which they operate, and HR needs to play a massive role in understanding that broader environment and the holistic ecosystem as they're thinking about the policies, the programs, how they're going to help workers be successful, not only within the four walls of the organization, but in the ecosystem overall. So that represents the 10 chapters that we have in our report. This is quite a broad report that I just went through in 30 minutes to hopefully give you the flavor of it. This gives you the frame of the whole report. The entire report is broken into those three attributes that I talked about of purpose, potential, and perspective. And then the memo of HR, as I just mentioned, is our 10th chapter. You could see all the individual chapters I just went through here. For those who are interested, and I hope everyone was interested, the report is available online. This is the link to it. You could actually download it and you can actually play with some of the data. I know Yves is going to take us through some of the data specific to Belgium, which will be pretty interesting. And I also want to mention, I talked about the fact that as authors, we combed through a lot of the data in the report. The survey was actually sent in September of last year, 2019. And we wrote the report pretty much leading up to about January of 2020, which is right when the reality of the global pandemic hit. And at that moment, we sort of stopped and said to ourselves, what do we do? Like, we wrote this report, now there's this global pandemic and it's changing everything. Should we go back and edit the report? And we decided not to, because we felt that the report really should stand on its own. But what we did was we wrote a compendium report. This is a pretty short report. This is about maybe a 20-minute read, a 15 to 20-minute read. But what we did was we went back and we looked at all of the human capital trends that I just took you through. And we talked about how they relate to COVID-19, the pandemic, what's changed, and how they connect to what we've written in the report. And we found an incredible connection between what's happened in the pandemic and the trends that we wrote about. And we shared that here. We would certainly encourage you guys to read that as well. And hopefully this will give you some things to think about as you are moving from recover into thrive, and as you are, as we put it, returning to work in the future of work, and really embracing the future, which is what this new DNA and these three attributes of purpose, potential, and perspective are intended to do. So with that, I'll end on this. We strongly believe that it is about the fusion of humans and technology that will drive the world moving forward, that the organizations that resolve the paradox of how to remain distinctly human in a technology-driven world are the ones that will succeed and thrive. And this is what we truly believe is the future of work, and frankly, the future of the human capital space. So with that, Yves, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Erica. And indeed, I hope I didn't steal too much of the thunder. So now probably will be clear why we have the next 4 sections, hopefully. So as I start looking at it from a lens of a bit of statistics in terms of the Belgium results, this is also a moment for you to ask you again, sort of the opportunity to raise questions. I can talk to the statistics for the next 20 minutes. I would think it's more interesting if you use it also to raise some questions. There's over 160 of you in this webinar, so please don't be shy. I promised Erica we would have some questions, but I have a bit of a bad reputation in Belgium for not having many questions. So please help me here, all of you. There is the chat, there's the Q&A. I think I give you a number of moments. So I'll start looking into the actual Belgium results in terms of readiness and importance. I think just before looking into it, just to give a bit of a perspective, what everything Erica said from a Belgium lens is just to highlight some elements. I think if you look at the bottom in the middle, you see sort of the number of HR respondents, and it's even a bit further tweaked to non-HR when it comes to the 492 Belgium respondents out of the 9,000. So we have even more of a lens of not so much what HR, but relatively speaking, there is a bias to non-HR. The same thing applies to C-suite and VP. If you look at the right, it's if you total C-suite and VP for Belgium, it's about 36 if I add 18 and 18, which is a bit higher, actually quite higher than what we see globally. Globally, you see about 22% in the category C-suite and VP. So I think this is interesting. I would say even more interesting is probably the right way to phrase it from a Belgian perspective in terms of looking into that lens. And then last, from a sort of size perspective, this was surprising to me. So if you look at the global results, especially surprising in terms of the size of our organizations in our local market, small is relatively comparable, so 56 to 51 in terms of representation. Large is 19 versus 22 globally. So I think that shows that even in the mix of small, medium, and large organizations is roughly the same type of size in terms of respondents. So I think that's interesting to look at sort of the type of insights from that perspective. And that's exactly to the point Erica made in the Insights app. You can also sort of make even more cross-section, because I'm sure you would want to compare from a geography perspective in your specific industries. And please bear with me, I cannot answer these different cross-sections. So this is just one lens, which is showing sort of respondents base. This is the overview. So this is a lot of numbers. Apologies for that. Maybe not in the most visually easy element to follow. What you see there on the left side is all of our trends, all the 10 trends that Erica touched on briefly. There's more to come in the next 4 webinars, which is looking at importance, to what extent that the respondent indicates importance, and the readiness. And the gap is just the mathematics, the first number minus the second number, that is the gap, just to put it into perspective. And this is something that, if you look at it roughly, sort of the order, the ranking in terms of importance is relatively speaking the same, but there is sort of different heights of numbers. So our most important one is also well-being for Belgium, with 70% versus 80%. Maybe we're a bit less outspoken. Believe it or not, Erica, we seem to be a bit less outspoken. I have a bit of a different reputation, I think, with you, but besides that, it's the same order. Belonging is second, knowledge management is ex aequo third, with ethics and future work, which is exactly the same. 3 and 4 are the same place. We have a bit of a difference then. Reskilling is slightly higher in terms of order. So just to give a bit of a perspective. In terms of the gap sizes, you also see sort of quite a number of gaps, which is the biggest gap is 27% for us in Belgium, which is apart from governing workforce strategies, where we see a lower gap, which is surprising, because you might remember that Erica started with 3 numbers, the 12, 16 and 11. And 11 was the confusing part about the workforce insights in real time. And believe it or not, in Belgium, I'll repeat it, 0% of respondents indicated that we have workforce insight in real time. And then yet we have apparently a smaller gap. So there is something puzzling for me on top of the confusing part that Erica pointed out very beginning of the presentation. I think that perspective in terms of gaps is actually quite interesting. So the well-being is used to be trend number 1. Sort of 3 years ago, we had well-being as well as one of the trends, and it was trend number 1 as well in Belgium. So I think it's quite interesting to look at that. And just to give you one sort of insight into one of the specific statistics is, to what extent is well-being included in the way we design work? And globally, that's 89% indicate that well-being is not actually considered when designing work. In Belgium, that's about 79%, which is interesting. Sort of, is that just sort of the numbers where we have a different rating, where we are not as using the scale in the same way as maybe the rest of the world? That is one of the perspectives. So with that, we wanted to sort of share a number of highlights on the different sort of gaps, where also sort of the relative indication with smaller gaps, bigger gaps actually is actually quite interesting to look at. Maybe sort of some more insights about these 12, 16, 11 started with. So the positive element is only 12% using AI to replace workers. In Belgium, it's slightly better. It's only 10%. And looking at the concern in terms of the significant investment in lifelong learning, it's about the same. 53% said that 50 to 100% of the workforce should be changing skill set in the next 3 years. Belgium 55%, which gives sort of roughly a similar indication in terms of gap. So I think that is what I wanted to give a perspective. And there is a question on the Q&A, Erica. I'll read it out loud because I'm not sure if you or I would answer it, so that gives us a bit of time. Do you have a view on which industry organizations are leading in dealing with the paradox?
Yeah, I saw the question come through, and I'm not sure there's any, it's interesting to me. I think that coming out of the pandemic, we have started to see, I think in particular, some of the industries where they see a close connection between what they're doing and the product that they're making and the impact on society. I think we're starting to see lead in that paradox. The example I use is there was a great story on Lysol, and that there are folks on the manufacturing floor they said for the first time they were actually seeing how the work that they were doing contributes to the organization's mission and then to the mission of society, and that they felt that they've never been more productive. I think that's a great example of an organization that's embracing purpose. I think the ones that are leading in the area of potential are the ones that have completely had to retool their workforce to do something different, where their industry has fundamentally changed and they're seeing individuals take on new roles that they've never taken on before in different ways. I think that they are starting to see, okay, first of all, human potential is great, right? I think most organizations completely underestimated the power of human potential. And now they're seeing that human potential come to life as they're moving people between jobs. So to me, it's, the consumer industry, because I think they've had to completely sort of retool in the context of what's happening. For sure, manufacturing, absolutely. I think we're starting to see that. In all honesty, as ironic as this may sound, I'm not the technology industry, not much has changed, right? The technology industry, I think most would say, has sort of gone uninterrupted. Things are even getting better. More people are using virtual, more people are looking at technology. So they haven't had to face the sense of adversity that a lot of organizations have, as they've sort of said, okay, we need to quickly pivot. And then they've started to see the power of humans and what they can do when they truly motivate people, capture their potential, connect them to purpose, and start to have insights that give them a sense in terms of how they can leverage humans for the future. I think those are the industries that we're going to really see leading. Eve, I don't know what your perspective would be.
I was looking on the Insights app, and I think indeed sort of life sciences also has an interesting sort of further diving into link to the actual products. I think that was an interesting one for me to look at that perspective, and I would be keen to see how that further evolves as we sort of recover and thrive. There's at least 5 more questions, Erica, so I'll fire them at you, and if you want to fire them back at me, of course, you're welcome. One of the questions is, generations is not the best lens, is what we are suggesting. So if you have big employee group, so how do you look at it from a different lens? Because going individual might be difficult if you have thousands of employees.
Yeah, and by the way, I definitely don't think it should be individual. I think individual, I agree, that would be too difficult. But it's, we put in the report a couple of examples. So, personality, we looked at things like whether individuals are introverts or extroverts. We looked at whether individuals are naturally makers or doers or managers, because usually individuals could fall into those 3 categories. And I don't think it's replacing generation with one other segmentation type. I think it's about using data to understand different characteristics of individuals to sort of segment them together. So, would you run a training session differently for individuals who are introverts or extroverts? I think you would. I think I would engage totally differently because they behave differently. So it's really about understanding those attributes that will allow you to craft your workforce programs and strategies in a way that best works for them. And in the chapter, we actually talked about, imagine if you did your learning programs based on this type of segmentation. Imagine if you did recruiting based on this type of segmentation, what would it look like? And I think that's what you need to start to look at. But the chapter itself does provide a number of other examples.
Yeah, maybe just one quick addition to that. Even in Europe, where GDPR is something that we are by now world famous with, you can do segmentations at different levels, sort of looking at nodes in a network as well, which is in addition to the different characteristics you were mentioning. Another question is about how useful is it? So looking at, for example, well-being, we give a lot of insights. How do you sort of, beyond sort of interesting, how do you use this as a reader of such a report?
How do you use the actual trends chapters as a reader?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that question come through, and I do think it could be, somewhat overwhelming to think about where to get started. And I actually think the best place to get started is and I said this earlier, but the common theme amongst all of these trends is really around the work itself. And so I think that one opportunity that organizations have, if you truly want to start to embrace these trends and become distinctly human, is to start by evaluating the work. Is there an area of your business where work has to radically change, where the outcome of work that you have today needs to be drastically different moving forward as you're coming out from the pandemic, as the world is shifted. And take a look at that area, that outcome of work, and ask yourself, how do we design that work? Are we designing that work in a way that optimizes human potential? Are we designing that work in a way that really brings in the power of technology and AI in a teaming ability? Are we designing that work in a way to promote well-being? Are we designing work in a way that an individual's contributions can really be understood and effectively managed? I think you may find the answer to those questions is no. But if you go through and reimagine the way that work gets done in the context of these trends, you might start to understand then how to use work as a way to shift and bring some of these trends in ongoing. Another place that I think is absolutely easy to get started would be on the governing workforce strategies chapter. Take a look at the 12 questions that we pose in that chapter. Ask yourself, does your organization track those metrics? Ask those questions that are there. Could you easily answer those questions through the data that you're collecting? If not, to me, that's an opportunity to start to look at how to get those insights and start to provide those insights, not only to your executive team, but to your board of directors. And that will start to show you where gaps exist, which of the trends you really need to focus on, which of the attributes you're really falling behind on. So those would be two actions, Eve, that I think I would take if I was an organization starting down this path.
Excellent. Another question that came in through the chat is, will remote work become a new standard? And secondly, how will it affect the social enterprise?
There's no doubt that remote work is going to become part of the new standard, though I will tell you, this is a personal view. I think these organizations coming out saying you can work from home forever are jumping the gun. I think they are, and I apologize if any one of you are on the phone, but I just think it's way too early to say that. I definitely think that there has been a wake-up call on the power of remote work and virtual work. And I think, I like to say this to folks, but I almost believe that anything can be done in a crisis. If you're in a state of panic, someone's holding a proverbial, gun to your head, you could pretty much do just about anything. But the question comes down to sustainability. And the only way to sustain having remote work as part of the way you work moving forward is to do some of the things that are mentioned here, right? You need to invest in new capabilities, right? Doing remote work isn't just about having Zoom, as we talked about earlier. Doing remote work is about having new leadership capabilities. It's about setting up your teams more effectively. It's about building technology into your teams appropriately so you can get the work done differently. How are you going to promote well-being? Most people, Zoom fatigue, everyone's talking about it. If you don't redesign your work for well-being, then remote work is just going to end up being exhausting. People feel like they're on video conferences all day, every day. So do I think remote work is here to stay? Yes. Do I think it's the only way we're going to see work get done moving forward? No. Do I think remote work and the success of remote work will depend on adopting many of the trends we talked about here? Absolutely. Because we have to take a step back and say to ourselves, working in a remote world requires a new way of thinking and a new way of being. And if you don't address those things, then remote work just simply is taking the existing work and trying to do it by yourself. I think it's going to lead to loneliness, and I think it's going to have an impact on productivity. So it has to be both.
Thank you. The next question is building on part of the example you gave earlier about sort of different attributes in terms of segmentation. You mentioned, amongst other things, introverts and extroverts, which makes a lot of sense. But I think in my mind, it's sort of re-emphasizing the paradox to tackle, which is, what about the fact that many employees worry, and maybe worry even more about the use of their personal data for the organization, that big brother syndrome?
Yeah, I think this is I think it's a concern, but it's like anything else. I think about the works councils, and I won't try to get too out of my depth, but we always say, if you want to work with works councils, one of the things you have to do is explain the why, right? It's not just about, I want to take the data in, it's about why you're using it. And I think it's the same thing here. We're asking for more data for workers. And if that data is just being used and the employee doesn't know how it's being used, then I agree. It's going to create the sense of, you're just invading my privacy. But if we're able to say to a worker, we're going to ask and try to understand you at an individual level, and as a result, we're going to be designing programs that work for you to help you maximize your potential. Then I think we have the ability to help employees understand and workers understand why we're doing that. And that's a big part of perspective, right? I think we have to get to an era of increased transparency, of explaining the why. We have to shift out of a world where the executives make decisions and then they're communicated down and no one really understands the rationale. Being transparent about the why. Why are we collecting this data? Why do we believe we need to segment past generation? Why do we need to understand you at a more individual level? And the fact that we're trying to maximize that person's contribution, that person's connection, that person's potential. Now, all of a sudden, it's about the individual getting better, not just about the organization wanting to collect data. And I think that's very much the spirit of the social enterprise coming to life. But I think most organizations, they don't necessarily communicate the why. They're very good at communicating the what. And that is a big shift that has to take place. But in a world where there is so much transparency, where almost anything that happens in an organization can be on the next news cycle, I think organizations need to get more comfortable. And this is the emerging and changing contract between workers and the organization. There has to be that more personal relationship created. And that's why we need to understand the individuals at a much deeper level. Sorry, Eve, I'm going quickly because I want to make sure we get to all the questions.
Sure. Thank you for that.
2 minutes left.
Last question, I think, in terms of well-being. I mean, it was number one even before COVID. So maybe we could even make the assumption that it might have gained further importance in the last sort of 11 weeks. Any examples of how organizations have addressed well-being more broadly, embedded in work, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, the first example that we give in the report is about Microsoft Japan. And I don't know if you guys read about them, but that's where they put in the 4-day work week. Now, not every organization can do that, but I think it could be things like looking at how you break down work by teams and how you construct teams based on the individual needs. So if someone is a caretaker and they have to spend time with their child in the morning versus someone who has to care for an elderly parent in the evening, or someone who really understanding that and then constructing the teams and the schedules to allow for that flex is a good way to do it. It could be as simple as taking breaks during meetings and making that a formal part of the process. It could be about tracking, well-being stats. We've seen a lot of, fitness competitions that are being done, but what if that became part of a check-in that you do as part of the team every single day? I think we do a lot to focus on well-being, but it's the simple act of, as you design a work process, asking yourself, where in that process should I inject a focus on well-being? That's really what it's about. And I do think there are many different ways in order to do that. Those are just a couple of examples that we highlighted in the report.
Thank you, Erica. Just conscious of time. Thanks a lot for joining and taking all these questions. To all the participants, thank you a lot as well for joining. Next session is coming Thursday, 9 o'clock, which is a bit early for you, Erica, so I'm sure you will not be joining that one. But for all the participants, please join our next session or any of the other ones coming up. Thank you very much and have a safe evening and speak soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.